Hi, everyone, and welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. We are really in a wonderful place today. I get to talk with a radio DJ. Anybody know what a radio DJ is? Does anybody know what radio is anymore? We're going to talk about that. Um, Personally, I always think radio is better than television anyway. I'm a fan of Fred Allen, the old radio comedian who once said that the biggest problem with television is they call it the new medium, and that's because that's as good as it's ever going to get. Medium. So there you go. Anyway, we're really glad to be here. And our guest is Joe Kendrick, and you work at WNCW, right?
That is correct.
And it's a station in North Carolina. And so we'll talk about radio. We'll talk about all sorts of stuff as we go through. And I learned a few things today that I never knew before, even though I was doing radio for many years. We'll talk about that. But anyway, Joe, welcome to Unstoppable Mindset. We're glad you're here.
Michael, thanks so much for having me.
Well, why don't we start with the early Joe? Tell us about Joe growing up and all that.
Grew up in a little town that still doesn't have a stoplight, that's roughly 2 hours east of from where I live now, and in Stanley County, North Carolina, just east of Charlotte. Pretty idyllic setting, honestly. We lived off in the woods. I could walk back and forth to school, which wasn't terribly far away. It was quiet. My first instinct upon graduating high school was to get out and never come back, like a lot of people that grow up in sleepy little towns. But it was a good childhood, honestly.
Yeah. I grew up in Palmdale, California, which was a small town. And I, for the first 3 grades, walked to school, or because I learned how to ride a bike, I wanted to ride my bike to school. Because there weren't other blind people, and so I just kind of wanted to always do that, and I did. I rode the bike to school. It wasn't a big deal. My brother and I rode our bikes, and that was not a big problem. But I know what you're saying, and I never thought I would move back to Palmdale, and I haven't. But I also grew up 55 miles west of a town called Victorville, and Victorville, as I described it, compared to Palmdale's 2,700 people when I was growing up, wasn't even a speck on a radar scope compared to Palmdale. But in 2014, we decided to move down from where we were living in the Bay Area to be closer to family. And the only place where we could find to build a house to make it accessible for my wife, Karen, was Victorville, which in 2014 had over 115,000 people. Go the heck and figure that.
Big city.
Yeah, and it's grown from there. Well, so you grew up in a small town, and there's a lot of merit and value to being able to do that, needless to say. So
Sure is.
yeah.
Yeah, it was so small that our school was K through 8 and then high school.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure if they have middle school there now yet, but that same high school is more or less the same from what I understand.
We had most of our schools were K through 6. In our elementary school, we had one school, Sage School, that was K through 8. So anyone, when they went into the 7th grade, anywhere in the Palmdale area, went to Sage School for 2 years, and then we went on to high school. But it wasn't a separate school. So never really thought of it as middle school, but I guess it sort of was. But it was fun. Well, so you come by being interested in radio and being a DJ and all that pretty honestly from early times growing up, huh?
I was always fascinated with the radio and music in general. Had those driveway moments that people talk about where you just can't turn off the radio because the song is so good. But I was a kid and my parents would just turn off the engine and go inside the house. I remember those moments before I was able to actually have a car myself and leave the engine on and listen to the rest of the song. But remember listening to radio as early as 5 and liking songs on the radio. And then in high school, calling in and making requests, talking to the DJs, recording songs off of the radio on a jam box, subscribing to Rolling Stone, subscribing to cassette clubs. I'm a Gen Xer, so cassettes were the big thing for me,
Yeah.
buying blanks, dubbing off albums, or just recording off of the radio and making mixtapes that way before going to college and eventually getting on board at a radio station where I really got into the deep end with music.
Did you do much with eight tracks? A lot of
I
people
didn't
probably
do,
don't know what that is, but
I'm familiar enough with eight tracks, but never had one myself.
yeah. So an eight track is a much thicker cartridge than a cassette, and it was the hit for a little while, but it didn't last too long. Cassettes came along and were okay, and then other kinds of medium and so on. But eight tracks were supposed to be good in cars, but I'm not sure that they ever were all that great.
I guess being a bulkier media and the fact that they would sometimes switch or reverse in the middle of a song,
Yeah, which was frustrating.
right?
But yeah, has gone the way of so many things. It's gone the way how is this for? It's gone the way of CDs. But anyway, that's another story.
Well,
Uh,
cassettes haven't truly gone away.
no, cassettes haven't. They're still around.
There is a subculture of cassette collectors and people releasing music on cassettes, if you can believe it.
Well, and there's certainly a subculture of people who still like vinyl records.
And vinyl records are the largest selling physical media now, way more than CDs.
Yeah.
Couple million albums sold a year, I think, thereabouts.
Also, there is a fairly substantial group of people who would say that vinyl still has the best audio quality, sound quality from CDs and all the other kinds of things. That vinyl is still the best, and I'm kind of with them. I agree.
You can hear things on vinyl. Now, you need the right stereo. You need
Of
a pretty
course.
high-end setup to distinguish, and you need to do an A/B kind of test. You need to compare it to a CD and listen to the vinyl. But pristine vinyl in an ideal setting can surpass what you get on disc because digital technology is always shaving off the analog wave in whatever minute way that it's doing. It's having to reduce it to ones and zeros.
Yeah. And so there's just always going to be potentially a lag or not as good a quality, needless to say. So you got to college, and what did you do in college dealing with radio, and what did you major in?
I was a journalism major
Okay.
and have leaned on that experience and that the learning and the all of that I got from college throughout my life, and still consider myself a journalist. Working in radio and presenting the news on the radio, for example, but also just being a writer. So in college, wanted to be on the radio right away, but didn't have enough knowledge, didn't have enough background to really jump in. It was incredibly competitive to get on board at WXYC, and still is, from what I understand. Back then, everybody wanted to be on the radio, and Chapel Hill is a big school, so there was a lot of competition, and their screening process was rigorous. So you had to know some things, and I really didn't know enough, having come from listening only to FM radio, and
Mm.
having read what I read in magazines like Rolling Stone, and having collected cassettes. And I was only 18, so I did not get in my first try. And then the next year, I had to wait another year for them to hire people again. And I got in that next year because I buckled down and said, I'm really going to learn some more of this obscure underground, indie rock, alternative kind of music that they were really deep into there.
Well, and of course, as time went on, there were people who spoofed and played with radio. George Carlin, wonderful wino radio. Wonderful, wonderful wino, the big sound in the big town. Yeah, it's
Yes.
1750, just above the police calls, kids. Oh gosh. Oh boy. Yeah. He was such a spoofer of some of the top 40 stuff. It was kind of cute, but radio has always been kind of fascinating. And so you got into to being able to be there, and then what did you do?
Out of college, I got a job, and it wasn't my intention to have a career in radio, but I always wanted to have a hand in radio and to remain, have that as an outlet. And I moved to the town where I live now and began volunteering at this radio station at WNCW the same year that I graduated college. A couple years after that, I moved away and lived on the coast in Wilmington, North Carolina for close to 3 years and knocked around with a little bit of radio down there, but it wasn't the same scale. It wasn't the same kind of radio that we have here at WNCW. It was like the college station there at UNCW it was on cable access only. They had lost their
Mm.
FM license, and then I was a board operator on Sunday afternoons for the public radio station there. But when I came back to Western North Carolina, I started volunteering again at WNCW and then started a business. I was a lighting franchise and landscape lighting company that had just begun the year before. So about 1997, I began putting in low voltage lighting systems to make people's houses look beautiful at night and did that for 10 years. It was a pretty good run. I I still really enjoy having that entrepreneurial side and that spirit, and that's present in a lot of what I do with all of my projects surrounding what is my core here at WNCW. And we can probably touch on those as we go on, but the business world eventually got to be enough of a grind, or I guess you could say the sort of the corporate world and the franchise that I was in. Eventually, I wanted to leave, and so I sold that business,
Hmm.
and pretty quickly got on full time here at WNCW.
Doing what?
I was the morning host at first, so
Ah,
I was on from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. weekdays.
my big claim to fame, as far as anybody famous in radio, was Don Imus actually started at KUTY in Palmdale, where I grew up. Although I never listened to him there. But anyway, um, beyond that, I actually, when I was in college, I did a little bit of professional radio as well. I was playing old radio shows, and KUTY heard about my show at UC Irvine and asked if I would be willing to do a Sunday show for them. And they actually normally didn't broadcast on Sunday, but they powered up the station, and we did a show every Sunday for a couple of years, which was kind of fun.
There is Rick Dees. That's who I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
Rick Dees was a DJ at WXYC.
Ah.
Ann Litt is program director at KCRW, which is a pretty well-known public station in
Santa Monica out here in
Santa
California.
Monica, I think. Yeah,
Right.
so she's been there for 30 years. So a couple of accomplished WXYC and Chapel Hill alumni.
Yeah. KCRW is still going strong. They don't do old radio like they used to. And I enjoyed playing old radio shows because I loved the history. But my start in radio was more technical. I wanted to do science things, and my parents bought me a radio kit, and I learned how to build. It was a like 10-in-1 thing. You could build different kinds of radio receivers and a transmitter. And I built a radio transmitter and played DJ in my bedroom with my 1 milliwatt battery operated thing, but it was fun to do.
Hmm.
And then, of course, went on into college and did things from there. And now, of course, we have podcasting, which is a little different than radio. But there's a lot to be said for the talent that you get in radio that you can carry over to podcasting.
Sure, it's all just a means of putting out your story. Uh, Podcasting, there's so many different kind of podcasts. There are music podcasts, there are talk podcasts, there are podcasts like mine, podcasts like yours, but it's all really the same kind of instinct, especially the root of it is the same.
Right. Yeah, and it's still, if you're going to do it right, it still takes talent, and it still takes understanding how to relate to audiences to make it work well.
Yes, indeed.
Well, one of the things, well, let me do this first. So you now are back at WNCW, and how long have you been there?
It will be 20 years this
Wow.
fall that I'm full time, but all told, if you count all of the volunteer years and the part-time years, because I was a volunteer and then part-time, the whole decade that I was in business for myself, it's over 30 years now. So there's
Yeah.
really only about 5 years of WNCW's entire history that I've not been present.
Well, you're doing your business of low voltage lighting and all that. And how does that all, what do you think about now the fact that we have so much in the way of LEDs and much
Mhm.
less powerful kind of lighting, and how all the world has migrated to that in so many ways?
LEDs, they're great. They're, function on a lot less wattage to make the same
Yeah.
amount of illumination, and they don't produce heat
And
like incandescent bulbs do. So
yeah.
you don't wind up cooking things or catching anything on fire. With landscape lighting, you have to be careful about stuff like that. You can't bury certain kind of lights in mulch, for example. Um, or else you might have a fire,
Yeah.
unless it's a cool lamp like an LED.
Yeah. Well, nowadays it is so much, the strength of the world is all LEDs in so many ways. And you're right, there's very little heat. I can I can feel some heat when I touch an LED, but so very little. Um,
Right.
but it's interesting how the industry has progressed, as it were. Well, and speaking of progressing industries, let's talk about this business we've been discussing, radio. Why should people listen to radio today when you can get all the music you want online and streaming it and all sorts of stuff like that? Why radio?
To me, it's the personal connection is the real draw for radio. It's a person, ideally a live person in the moment that is across these airwaves, but they're in the room with you. They're in your headphones with you. They're in the car with you. And that's a voice, a familiar voice that can become a lifelong friend, depending on how things play out. Or at least they're there for you in the moment. And they, in an ideal situation, at a station like a WNCW, where we have a lot of leeway and a really broad range of music to choose from, then we can be the curator that introduces you to your next favorite song, your next favorite band, your next infatuation of an artist that might surprise you. So versus all of the online streaming, etc., where you've got more or less unlimited reach and choice for music, but you're more or less letting the algorithm guide you. That seems to be what most people are doing with those platforms. And I'm not chapter and verse on how people use streaming, so I may be a little bit off base here, but essentially you don't have that voice. That's one major difference is you don't have somebody that is able to talk to you about where you are at right now. So for us, we are very much grounded in the community and the region, and we're talking about not only normal, you know, check the box of weather, check the box of what's happening in the news locally, but really kind of getting deeper into representing the people that live here, having artists from the region come on the radio, having interviews with people in government or in the arts community, etc. And so with radio, like the way we do it, you get a reflection of where you're at, the community that you're a part of, and it also broadens the scope to show you the outside world and to help you discover all sorts of things, including a lot of music, especially for us,
Hmm.
that you would not get any other way. And a radio DJ is a thinking human that can put together themes and turn on a dime and take your requests. There are so many things that are better about interacting. This is basically interacting with a live human than with, say, interacting with AI.
Yeah.
There's just no comparison, really.
No, no, not at all. What about talk radio as opposed to radio with music and radio personalities and so on? So many stations are going to talk radio, and I'm not necessarily a great fan of that.
I'm not sure exactly how the popularity of talk radio has come about, but I do know that so many radio stations changed over to an all talk format.
Yeah,
So it's got a lot of popularity. And again, I think that that goes to my earlier point that this is a familiar voice. These are people that you become acquainted with.
right.
They become like a friend that you can rely on, that's there for you every day at that time.
Yeah. And I think that's absolutely correct. You're still dealing, no matter the person or whatever, you're still dealing with a person. And sometimes they can go a little bit crazy, but still you're dealing with a real personality. And what talk radio does bring is an ability for people to call in a lot more frequently and talk to that personality, whoever it may be.
Exactly. Yeah, we get requests and do our best to honor those requests whenever possible. And, just to speak to, for us here at WNCW, and we're not the normal or the sort of the average or the most representative radio station amongst FM radio stations. We're a
Mhm.
public station and we are a niche amongst public radio stations with the way that we do things. But, you know, about the sort of bond that we have with our audience during times of stress, like during the COVID lockdown, like when Hurricane Helene hit
Yeah.
a little over a year ago here in the Carolinas. People relied on us far more because they were cut off from the outside world for that period of time. And we were kind of a lifeline. I've taken these calls. A bunch of us have taken these calls and gotten, out there in the world, in person, people telling us face to face, or emails, people telling us that we were their lifeline to sanity during
Mm.
periods like that. I have, and other hosts here have had feedback from people that said that, you literally saved my life in the sense that we were sort of a rock for them to cling to in whatever period of life that they were in. It wasn't necessarily in an emergency situation, but it was just that we were so essential to their day to day. And that is an amazing feeling to hear from people just how much it means to them to be able to have this experience.
Yeah. Well, and the reality is that nothing can touch like radio. Um, you don't have televisions that are small enough to carry in a pocket very much, or anything like that, like radio. And the reality is that radio can be so flexible and move so quickly compared to television because you're not necessarily relying on the same level of equipment, which isn't to negate what television can bring, but still, as you point out, people can call in, people can listen and hear so many things. And radio has always had a major influence. I am still amazed that Orson Welles' War of the Worlds from back in 1938 caused such a stir around the country. But I understand why, because Mercury Theater in the Air, which was his show, decided to broadcast War of the Worlds, and they made it sound very realistic. They had a guy who sounded like the Secretary of War talking about the Martians invading and so on. But lest you still think that was an aberration and a coincidence, back in, I think it was 1971, a radio station in New York decided to recreate War of the Worlds, and they wanted to modernize it and update it. But they advertised on the radio with flyers and in so many ways all around the area for days before the broadcast that they were going to do it. And then on the day that the broadcast actually took place, the sheriff's department was listening. Well, they weren't really listening until somebody called who happened to be drinking and was talking about the Martians invading, and they said, "Turn on the radio." Well, they turned on the radio, and again, it was this incredibly realistic broadcast, and they started calling their people and calling them in and all sorts of things like that. And then at some point, the announcer came on and said, this was a recreation, it's not real. And the sheriff's people just spent the rest of the hour eating pizza and listening to the broadcast. But people react to that. And
Yeah.
that's what
Yeah, they
radio
do.
can do, like nothing else.
Yeah, we like to play portions of or string out the War of the Worlds on Halloween a lot
Yeah.
of times. We've done that a number of years. April Fools is a great day for that sort of thing here too. I've had a lot of fun with creating my own April Fools jokes on air. The last time I think it was Scott Kelly went up to the International Space Station.
Mm-hmm.
I was inspired that morning before I went on the air that day to do an April Fool's joke where we called Scott Kelly on the International Space Station about the experiments that they were running playing WNCW to the petri dishes and the microbes on the International Space Station. And I've downloaded, you can go to NASA and their website and download a lot of audio. And so these are transmissions from back in the day and liftoffs and things like that. So I had some of those sound effects, and I got somebody, a willing person here at the college to be impersonate Scott Kelly, and we kind of altered his voice in the software and played that on the air. Fooled practically everybody, including my sister. So it was great. I've done that a number of times, and it's amazing to witness how people will fall for stuff. I mean, that's harmless. I'm not going to do anything that's out of bounds, but that speaks to the whole phenomenon, like what War of the Worlds tapped
Yeah.
into all those years ago.
And Orson Welles never expected, at least so we hear, never expected that kind of a reaction. But again, it was so realistic at the time, it's not surprising when you think about it. Also, there were a lot of people who were listening to other radio broadcasts and it was on, I think, Halloween or October 30th, actually, and turned over to War of the Worlds halfway through the broadcast, which is when it really got serious and the Martians
Yeah.
were, and
Yeah, because Wells had told everybody at the onset before the presentation began that this was a show.
yeah, it was Mercury Theater on the Air, was his
Yeah.
typical weekly show.
Yeah. But like you say, a lot of people tuned in afterward when people started flipping out, telling their neighbor to turn on the radio.
Yeah. I lived in Massachusetts from 1978 to 1981, and it seems to me, I think it was in 1979 April Fools. There was a television show that, or a television station that created a news broadcast about a volcano that suddenly appeared near Barnstable, Massachusetts, and was erupting, and people were running away. And of course, it was an April Fool's thing. Somebody got fired over that one because I guess it
Oh,
got pretty serious. But yeah, still, it wasn't intended to be malicious. But people react.
yeah, that one could have more real world consequences.
Yeah, and that's unfortunately true. But it was amazing to hear the recreation of War of the Worlds from the New York station, because they were doing radio transmissions and everything was just so realistic. I'm again just not surprised. That's what radio can do and does do. Um, and the reality is that it's the only medium that can be so strong in doing some of that, which is really pretty amazing.
Hmm.
So, what's the difference between commercial radio and public radio? And I know there's been a lot of talk lately about we don't need to fund NPR and public radio. Well, why not? Anyway, talk about that if you would.
Commercial radio is like it sounds, commercial radio. It's for profit business, and public radio is a nonprofit uh, sort of scenario. And I'd say that one of the best arguments for having public radio survive and thrive is that it's going to be able to present news and information and music and culture, honestly, that goes against the grain or otherwise would be ignored in a for-profit model system.
Yeah.
Uh, More in-depth reporting, news stories that take longer than a soundbite. There are all sorts of examples of in-depth journalism causing, real change and having a positive impact on the world, not just with radio, but with print media as
Yeah.
well. And, public radio is something that I think should exist is side by side with commercial radio and is going to be helpful for so many people, especially when you come down to having emergency situations where your public radio station, like ours, was set up by the state of North Carolina to serve the western end of the state that did not have any public radio. And so this was intentional that we would present news and information programming that was vital in the moment for everybody in regions that previously didn't have it. So this plays out all over the country where people will have a public TV or public radio station that will be able to alert them to natural disasters, for example.
Hmm.
That's just one very salient point as to the value of public radio. But not everything in the world needs to be for profit.
Right.
Um, if everything was for profit and there was no public sector, I think that we would be in trouble.
I agree. You know, public broadcasting, the public television station in Boston, for example, was one of the very first places that started providing audio descriptions for people who are blind of different programming. And of course, there also is where Sesame Street and other really significant shows have come from and continue to exist, which is important, I think, to our society.
Oh yeah, yeah. We need diversity in every in there are so many examples of where diversity is so completely necessary and beneficial. So you go to the natural world, for example, and diverse ecosystems are much more robust and resilient than ecosystems that are less diverse. So, in the business world, anytime you start to get towards a monopoly, then typically things start to degrade as far as quality of service, that sort of thing. Um, Diversity that is coming from the public radio world is an example of, if you want to use that metaphor of an ecosystem, it's part of the ecosystem that is going to benefit the rest of the ecosystem, is going to benefit the rest of society. Whether or not people actually use it, it deserves to be there.
Well, and at least it gives the choice,
Hmm.
which is so I've been just sitting here for a little while thinking about this. Back in sometime around 1957 or 1958, Stan Freberg, member Stan, created a record called the Old Payola Roll Blues. And it was all about satirizing payola, which was the money that agents and other people would pay to DJs to play particular songs and promote them. Do we see that kind of thing still going on today?
No, not at our level, at least.
Yeah.
The industry has changed so much that that went away a long time ago, I think.
Did you ever hear his record, the Old Payola Roll Blues?
No, I don't know that one yet.
I'll if you don't find it, I will find it and send it to you. Again, collecting old things like that is really kind of fun. It was very, I mean, it was funny, it was sarcastic, and it was satire, and it was supposed to be, but still, he was poking fun at something that at the time was very serious.
Oh, yeah.
And but I kind of thought that probably it didn't exist today. So what as a DJ, what is DJ being a DJ like at WNCW and so on, and what do you do? And tell me a little bit more about how it all works.
We have a lot of original programming here. Most of it is music based. However, we do have National Public Radio news headlines at the top of the hour during weekdays. We also have NPR's Morning Edition on weekday
Mm-hmm.
mornings. But the bulk of our programming is in-house. It's original music programming. During the week, we have a mix of music. It doesn't really have a name, but we will play a lot of roots-based music. So leaning into uh, blues, rock, jazz, folk, and into what's called AAA, which is album-oriented, adult album alternative, I think is what it stands for. But
Mm-hmm.
basically, anything that's not roots but is uh, more modern, popular styles of music. So we'll play everything from Texas fiddle music to the latest from Waxahachie, um, and and a lot of points in between. We don't play everything, but we have an incredibly broad and deep mix. We also have a lot of specialty shows or block programming in radio speak that are more specific to styles like bluegrass, jazz, classic country, Celtic, electronica, dub and reggae. We have theme shows for the Grateful Dead. We have a regional music focused show. We have lots of fun things like that.
So to really dig down and go into the world, have you ever played anything by Peter Schickele, PD Bach?
Oh, I've heard of that, but I don't know if we have played
That's
that.
pretty funny. It's really
PDQ
pretty.
Bach, that name, it
PDQ
does.
Bach.
Yeah, that rings a bell.
It is pretty hilarious. Again, one of those things. He really spoofs classical music pretty well. I've never seen him in concert, but I understand that he puts on quite a show.
Hmm.
But anyway, so you obviously must listen to a lot of music. What do you really like?
A broad range of music. I
Yeah.
pretty much listen to music, either listen to our radio station or both listen to new music every day. And I'm the kind of person that I could just listen to music all day, every day,
Yeah.
and a lot of nights
Yeah.
at home. I'm fairly plugged into music, as you might call it an addiction. I don't know. It's something that I thrive on. That that I'm constantly listening to new music, especially. We get tons and tons of solicitations and releases that come from labels, that come from artists directly, that is new music. And then there's an immense library here of 30,000 plus
Mm.
discs that we can go to, and you can find new music that's decades old. I do
Yeah.
that fairly often too.
Yeah. It's quite an adventure. But there's still nothing like Grandma got run over by a reindeer. But but yeah, I enjoy a lot of music. I do orient more probably toward big band. I've always been a big band fan and so on. But I do like a lot of different kinds of music. I've never been a great heavy metal fan, so I'm not as much an art a fan of that. But still, I like a lot of different kinds of music.
Yeah, we tend not to play heavy metal as
Yeah,
a rule. At least it's not a focus. I'm not saying that in the middle of the night you
yeah.
might not hear something that's pretty edgy and
Hmm.
leaning towards metal. And then there is that new Billy String song, which has kind of a bit of a metal breakdown in the middle.
So in the world today, why should people pay for music rather than just streaming it and download it, which they can do for a whole lot less money?
They can, and they pretty much do.
Yeah,
That's three quarters, the last time I checked, three quarters of the music industry is streaming.
yeah.
So it's taken over, and it doesn't look to be going away anytime soon. But unlimited choice is is unsustainable for artists, especially. I was reading just this week about how Spotify is 80% of what's on Spotify is non-monetized.
Hmm.
So anybody that doesn't have more than 1,000 plays, maybe it's a certain number of plays on Spotify, does not get royalties. And they're famous for not giving very much in royalties, period, for plays on their platform. But also, if they took all of their profit and spread it amongst the artists on their platform, it would still be an infinitesimal increase in the royalty that they're getting currently. So it's an unsustainable model as far as the reward to artists. I would argue that having an unlimited reach for music for such little money devalues the experience. Music becomes wallpaper at that point.
Yeah.
Then you're not investing anything truly into something that you want to keep. It's just background at that point.
Hmm.
And regardless of how much you play it and like it, it's not truly yours.
Yeah.
If the artist takes it off the platform, or the platform does away with it for whatever reason, then it's gone and you won't have it anymore. I think there's a lot to be said about physical media as far as the, well, a lot of it really. The liner notes, the ability to have the tactile uh, response, or the being able to touch, feel, smell, uh, to look at the photos, to experience putting the needle on the record, that sort of
Hmm.
thing. There's a lot to be said for that, I believe, but mainly I think that the music becomes more meaningful with that sort of phenomenon where you have to choose. You have limited resources to choose. You don't have enough time to listen to this music anyway, and that's the good problem that we have at a place like WNCW. Is there's tons of music that if we wanted to listen to it all would be impossible.
Yeah.
So this is what people have on streaming is there's tons of good music that they'll never be able to listen to. And I think that is essentially counterproductive to have that sort of setup.
Yeah. Do you think that the Spotify model in the long run will be sustainable?
Pendulum could swing the other way. I don't know. Can't read the tea leaves, honestly. But like I say, they do not have an incredibly profitable model,
Yeah.
honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's very slim margins in what streaming is doing.
So, on a slightly different subject, if we're talking about radio and all that, no matter what people say about radio and so on, you've also got services like SiriusXM that people listen to. And I don't know anything about the royalty issues with them and so on. But again, clearly, somebody saw the value in having radio, even though now what SiriusXM does is they provide it over essentially the entire United States or whatever, but still it's listening to radio.
Sure. Satellite radio, yeah. And you get a lot of music artists,
Yeah,
hosts on a Sirius XM,
yeah.
for example, and you get to plug into their world on a daily, weekly type basis, and that there's something to be said for that.
And I don't know what the profitability of it is, but it certainly seems to be continuing to be out there. And I subscribe to it. We
Hmm.
have it in the car, and I also um, listen to various broadcasts. In fact, a couple of days ago, I listened on Sirius XM to the Indiana Miami game because it was just easier to find it on Sirius XM, and the radio folks did a good job.
Hmm.
They
Yeah,
were broadcasting it from ESPN, but still it was Sirius XM, which was really good.
cool.
So tell us about your podcast a little bit.
I produce a podcast called Southern Songs and Stories, which is mostly about music from the South or the American South in our region here in Western North Carolina and upstate South Carolina. But I tap into artists that are national touring artists or international touring artists
Mm-hmm.
as well. And an interview-based podcast that is founded upon a conversation with an artist or artists. Most of the time, it's one artist at a time, but then there can be episodes where I'll interview multiple people. And a lot of writing goes into that where I've got commentary set up and then music excerpts of the artist or the subject matter throughout. And they're typically half an hour or so each.
Mm-hmm.
Produce those on every couple of weeks is my schedule. I try to make sure that I have two of these in a month. Over a holiday period, I'll take a break. It's impossible to have any sort of vacation time and keep producing the podcast. But
Yeah.
typically every 2 weeks, there's a new episode.
Well, and you come by your love of music and doing all this pretty honestly. We were talking at the very beginning. One of your relatives is Earl Scruggs from Flatt and Scruggs, Earl, the banjo player. Um, and that's a fascinating thing,
Yeah, Earl is pretty big around here. He,
as he
he's
should be.
yeah, he's still going and as far as the music and the legacy worldwide, honestly. And he grew up in Flint Hill, North Carolina, which is just down the road from where I live now. And we celebrate Earl Scruggs on the air here at WNCW. We also have, going into its fifth year now, the Earl Scruggs Music Festival
Mm.
in nearby Tryon. Yeah,
I
bluegrass. He's one of the big ones in the bluegrass world for sure.
I've heard him and Steve Martin play together, which was kind of fun.
Hmm. Yeah, Steve
Steve,
Martin has a home here in Brevard, North Carolina as well.
he's not too shabby of a banjo player, as it turns out.
Steve Martin did a lot with the Western North Carolina bluegrass band Steep Canyon
Steve
Rangers.
Canyon Rangers, right?
Yeah, he's got at least a couple of records with them. And We see him from time to time at music events, depending on what he's doing. He's going to have another season of Only Murders in the Building coming up, so we may not see him out on stage anywhere in the near term, but I've interviewed Steve a couple of times on projects that he was doing.
Well, and I remember the first time I heard him play the banjo. Actually, it was on a Saturday Night Live thing, and he wasn't really overly fancy, but I was impressed. And then I tracked him after that, and I've just been so amazed at the fact that he's such a great entertainer anyway, but he also plays a pretty mean banjo.
Yeah, it's not a gimmick. He loves the banjo and has played it well before he was famous.
Yeah, which is cool. Well, it Flat, Scruggs, and Steve Martin together never played, right?
Not that I know of,
Yeah, I'm not aware
because
that they
Flat and
did.
Scruggs broke up in the late 60s
Right.
and Lester Flat died in the late 70s.
Then, as far as other major groups like that in that era, there was always Homer and Jethro, which was
Homer and Jethro.
and what amazed me about them was when I learned that they were classical music trained,
Hmm.
but they did all the things that they did. They were a pretty good group as well.
Yeah, they were flat out awesome instrumentalists.
Yeah.
I think they were also married to twins.
Oh, were they? And I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But okay. Um, they among other things did a pretty good job of satirizing a lot of music. I remember 16 tons. They did that, Tennessee Ernie Fords, and their classic line in it was, "You load 16 tons. How do you feel? Too tired to work and too scared to steal." St. Peter, don't you call on me today, because I'm a digging the other way. Only those guys. That was pretty clever.
Yeah, they were hilarious.
So, how about the rest of your family? Do they enjoy the love of music like you do?
They do. My wife and I met at a concert at this Tuesday night show in Asheville back in 1999. We had a mutual friend that was at the show, and that's sort of how we connected. But my son, my youngest son especially, is into more the rock and roll and some of the roots
Mm,
music that I love. My oldest son, he is into a lot of electronic instrumental music.
okay. Interesting. How old is he?
He's 20, soon to be 21. My
Mm,
youngest is 18, soon to be 19.
well, and what is your wife like?
She is homesick now, unfortunately.
Oh,
Um, but she teaches art.
okay. What kind of music is she mostly interested in?
She's mostly listening to contemporary Christian music these days.
Okay. Nothing wrong with that.
Not at all.
I'm again, like a lot of things, more a fan of some of the older music. I'm Christian music. I'm a Stuart Hamlin fan and things like that. But um, I also have been involved in various church things, so I appreciate good contemporary Christian music as well.
Indeed. Good.
So when is UNC Chapel Hill going to win another basketball championship? I
Yeah,
don't
that's
know.
gonna
They gotta beat Indiana, but
they it's not gonna be this year. I'm a
no.
big college basketball fan going back to my childhood and the Dean Smith era, and then of course going to school and graduating from Chapel Hill. Was deep into it there, and have always enjoyed it since. It's just such a great release
Yeah,
to let that, sort of that emotion, that sort of joy, and it's such a nice thing to be able to do, to be able to let your hair down and watch a basketball game
yeah.
and yell at the TV, or yell in excitement at the TV, or yell because they lost again.
What
But
do you do?
yeah, what can you do? This year they are, boy, they're kind of at a shaky point, but it's still January. They
Yeah,
lost a couple of games. Their road trip to California did not go well. They've got a chance to at least start winning again with a game tonight. ACC is a pretty tough conference as a rule, but it's
Yeah.
greatly improved this year. So Duke, Virginia, Louisville, Clemson. I feel like you can't take a night off.
I mentioned Indiana, of course, which is football. Is there much of a football team at UNC?
No, sadly, it's been and continues to be mostly mediocre.
Mm,
We've got Bill Belichick as the coach now, which
ah,
made
may make a big
big,
difference.
big news a
Yeah.
year or so ago when they hired him with really lackluster results his first season and other sort of dramatic, controversial things along the way during the season that we don't have to get into here.
No,
But we don't see Carolina doing anything on the gridiron anytime soon. Uh, I'll believe it when I see it.
well, there you go. Well, we've been doing this an hour, and I'm going to have to go off and try to create a little bit of mischief elsewhere. So I'm going to thank you for being here. And if people want to reach out to you, how do they do that?
You can reach me by email, joek@wncw.org, or for the podcast, southernsongsandstories@gmail.com. You can also check out the podcast on all of the usual platforms. You can follow for free. I'm on Substack, social media. Just look up my name or Southern Songs and Stories, and you should find me.
I will find the old Payola Row Blues and send it to you.
That'd be great. I'd love to play
Yes.
that.
And a few other things. Well, Joe, thank you for being here, and I want to thank all of you for being here with us. We appreciate it. Wherever you're listening or watching, we'd appreciate you giving us a 5-star rating, but even more important, give us a great review. We'd love to get reviews. People listen to podcasts because they read reviews and they value what they see. So give us a good review. We would appreciate it. And if you'd like to email me, it's easy. It's speaker@Michael Hingson, MichaelHingson.com. If you know of anybody, and Joe, you as well, who might make a good guest on the podcast, would really appreciate you introducing us. So we are always looking for more people to come on and tell their stories. But for now, Joe, I want to thank you for being here. This has been absolutely wonderful.
It's been great talking with you, Michael. Thanks for having me.
If you're ready to go deeper into the ideas that shape how we see ourselves and others, I have a free gift for you. Head over to michaelhingson.com and download my free ebook, Blinded by Fear. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep choosing to live with an unstoppable mindset.